Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's training. My name is Liam McMahon, and I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator at Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota. Uh, I just wanted to come on camera right at the start to introduce myself because you're not going to see my face, but we'll be hearing my voice for the rest of this training. Um, so today we are talking about how to create a target universe. Something that you will need to do is you conduct political analysis to make a plan to win and to ultimately create the list of voters that you will engage on the doors, over the phone, and via text message. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff in this training. So before we get going, I want to make it clear what the most important things to take away are. I want you to be thinking about number one, the data available on yourself and what that reveals about who is and is not included in voter data and the implications for that on electoral programs. Two, how do we try and problem solve for those issues? What do we do well and where are areas we can continue to do better? Three, have a basic understanding of how models work and how to read them. And four, to know how we think about vote propensity. Excuse me. Hopefully, this will be helpful for you all as you do this work. If this were an in-person training, or if we were on Zoom together, this is the part where I would say, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions or drop them in the chat. Since we're recording this, however, I'll just say, please feel free to reach out to me with questions at mcmahonl@faithandmin.org. My email is right there on the first slide. So where do we start? The first thing to consider as you start this process, regardless of what campaign, ballot measure, power organization you're a part of, you're working around, first thing to consider as you start this process is how you're trying to use your list and what it's trying to measure. So are you working to pass a ballot measure or to elect a candidate? Where are you doing this work? The list that you create will be different depending on where in Minnesota you are and what kind of work you're doing. In today's training, I'm creating a targeted list for a hypothetical scenario in which we're attempting to pass a levy in Dodge and Olmsted counties that would increase funding for public education. So we're going to use this list to conduct a political analysis that helps us make a plan to win and to create the lists of voters that we would ultimately reach out to in several months once we're in a big field program to go out and actually win the election. Our targeting today is attempting to identify the people who are in our ideological base, opposition, and who are persuadable about this issue, as well as to find out who the people with children are in these two counties. The work of identifying people in our ideological base, opposition, and who are persuadable looks a little different than how a political party might conduct this targeting. Most party-driven data will be looking at a score that tries to measure someone's partisanship, or how likely they are to vote for Democrats or Republicans, respectively. We think about it along the lines of who shares our values, something heavily influenced by the Race Class Narrative Project. We'll talk more about that and how we use modeling and how you can use it later in the training. Before you actually start doing that, you need to think about what tools and skills you need to have to get going. So to build a target universe, there are some skills and access you will need to have. You'll need to know how to use My Voters in the van, which is sometimes called Vote Builder if you're doing it more on the campaign side. And you will also want to know how to use Excel. We'll be walking through the process of using both of these in this training. If you do not yet have access to either, talk to your campaign manager or supervisor about getting access to it. My Voters is the place where you'll do your targeting and create and edit your lists. Your lists can then be exported into Excel, where you can do some basic data analysis of your list. How do we start the targeting? To start the targeting work, you're going to want to log into Van. The first thing to look at is how many people live in this area, in this case, Dodge and Olmsted counties, and how many of them vote. Then we can start looking at where they live and their demographic composition. We can find all of this data and more, like age and sex data, previous vote history, in Van. And to do that, we're going to create a list of all the voters in these two counties. Then we're going to use a feature in Van called counts and crosstabs to do some initial analysis. So when you create a list in Van, you're going to scroll down to home districts on this create a new search page and select both Dodge and Olmsted counties and then run search. So you can see from my search there has 109,000 people on the list. That's going to create this list for you, which has 109,380 people in it. But who actually are those 109,000 people? If you have some familiarity with Southern Minnesota, you might have heard me say that that's how many voters there are in these two counties and thought, that can't be right. There are more people who live there. And that's true. There are a lot more people who live in Dodge and Olmsted counties. Their combined population is almost 180,000 people. However, this is a list of the registered voters that are in the voter file in these two counties. This list does not include people who are not registered to vote. Within our broader list of 109,000 people, the biggest group of voters is in the city of Rochester, with almost 78,000 voters, accounting for about 3/4 of the people in this list. How did I find that? By utilizing counts and crosstabs, which is the internal My Voters data analysis tool. You can get there when looking at your list by clicking the counts button that has a little pie chart in it, and then it will auto-populate with this run quick counts and crosstabs, and you're going to hit next. Once there, you can create data tables that visualize how many people there are per city in your list. You can also find that same data broken down by county, by Senate district, by House district, by precinct, and a lot more. So this is how I know that Rochester is the biggest city. You can see the data table there. We can also use counts and crosstabs to find demographic data. One helpful piece of demographic data to look at is age and race. This will give you a breakdown of how old different racial groups are in a given place. One important caveat about using this information, however, is that the race data is based on modeling, which is not always reliable. It uses input factors that are problematic and are often racist and classist. Internally at Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota, we've done work to improve on the race modeling that we have access to, and that's something that you can reach out to me and talk about in more detail if you would like. Please feel free to reach out if that is of interest to you. And at this point in the training, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to log into My Voters or Vote Builder, whichever it's called, inside your database, and look yourself up in the voter file. Look at how you have been race modeled. Look at how you might have been modeled about different issues or ideology or partisanship. And I guarantee you there's going to be something in there that's wrong. I tell you that with my record, it has correctly modeled my race, but my vote propensity score is that would be assigned to someone who is incredibly unlikely to vote. And that is in part because I have moved a lot in the past number of years. And it's also because I haven't been a Minnesota voter for all that long. I'm 24, so I've been voting in elections since 2016. But for a good chunk of the time from then to now, I was voting in Wisconsin. So I've only voted in one election in Minnesota. And so my turnout score is very low. So after you have a sense of the demographics in an area, it's time to dig into the political dynamics at play. This is where we start to introduce additional models and where we will talk about how we use modeling differently than political parties do. There are two main scores or models that campaigns will use as they build out their voter engagement universes. One that looks at partisanship, or how likely someone is to vote for Democrats, and one that looks at vote propensity, or how likely someone is to vote in a given election. Those scores will occasionally get more complex to model someone's ideology, or how likely they are to vote in a presidential election as compared to a midterm or off-year local election. We have access to all of those kinds of modeling at FIMN. I'm not sure what the DFL will have access to for those of you on the hard campaign side of it. And we wouldn't be able to talk about a specific score to use anyway, so that might be crossing a campaign finance line. By contrast, the two models that we tend to use to measure how likely someone is to support policies that advance racial justice and economic justice, respectively, correspond to the Race Class Narrative Project, or RCN. RCN is about connecting around shared values and stories rather than partisanship. And what RCN tells us is that across the country, there are roughly 25% of people that share our values about the kind of abundant, thriving communities we want to build, 25% who are opposed to them, and 50% who are persuadable. Sometimes they'll agree with us, sometimes they'll agree with the opposition, sometimes they'll split. So to identify our base, we look for the people most supportive of racial and economic justice. Our opposition is the people least supportive, and then everyone in between we classify as persuadable. And we do this by looking at the distribution of scores assigned to voters in a given model. For ease of this presentation today, I will be using a slightly different score to model ideology, one which measures how likely someone is to support progressive policies more broadly. That will give us a rough estimate of our base, opposition, and persuadable cohorts. Additionally, I will be using a score that estimates how likely it is that someone has a child present in their home. A key element of our electoral plan here will be engaging parents. And so we want to know how many parents there are. We also want to get a sense of their ideological breakdown because it may make sense to run a constituency outreach program where parents call parents and try to get them to vote in favor of this levy. One thing to consider as you're choosing scores to use is how many voters actually have the score in question applied to them in the voter file. Sometimes models will be created in the lead up to a big election. So there are a lot of models that were built in 2020 or in late 2019 in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election. And the composition of the voter file has changed from then to now. So there will be people who have registered to vote since then who will not have the model applied to them. It doesn't happen retroactively. People have to be updating the models. So you want to check like what percentage of people in a given area have the score that you're looking for. So in this case, 99% of people in these two counties in the voter file have a child present score, while only 86% have an ideology enhanced score, which is not perfect, but is still pretty good and is good enough that we're going to use it. When you are creating a list in My Voters, you're going to be able to see all of the different scores that can be applied to someone and that can be a part of the list that you're going to create. So as we start our process today, we're going to use this ideology enhanced score to get a sense of the ideological breakdown. That's this score right here in the middle, Target Smart Ideology Enhanced. After we figure out what score we're going to use, we're going to conduct our initial data analysis in Excel. And it's going to make sense why we're doing that in just a second. But to do that, we actually want to export our entire list, all 109,000 people and the data about them, as a file that we can open in Excel. You do that after you run your search by clicking on the export button. You're going to want to customize your export. It'll give you an option that'll say like run default export or customize. You want to customize and then type in the drop down bar at the bottom scores, select scores, and then export your file. Download and open your list in Excel, and then click on the insert window at the top of the screen. It's going to be in the top left, just to the right of this home button. You're going to go to insert and then go to pivot chart, which is right in the middle. A pivot chart is a very cool data analysis tool that exists within Excel. It will help you to visualize the data that's spread out across a big set of people, numbers, etc. It makes identifying trends in data very helpful. Then when you're actually creating a pivot chart, you will want to select the field that you're trying to put in the chart. So there's a little search bar here that I would recommend you start to search for the column name that you are including in your pivot chart. Select the data value. If you click on it, it will auto-populate in the values section here. You want to drag it into the axis section. That will put your data on both axes of this chart. And you want to make sure that the values section is conducting a count of the ideology scores. The default might be a sum, which would give you a different and skewed data analysis. So that was a lot of Excel verbiage that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But we've just gotten here and we've created this chart. And what does the chart actually mean? How do we interpret it? This is just a graph that is going in a shape like that. So models are always measuring between a scale of 0 and 100 how likely it is that someone will do a given thing. So how likely it is that someone is going to support raising the minimum wage, how likely it is that someone is going to vote for Democrats, how likely it is that somebody is going to vote for reactionary immigration policies. And so depending on the model, having a high score might be good or it might be bad. One score that we use regularly looks at how likely somebody is to have feelings of racial resentment. That we use when we're looking at our race class narrative modeling. And the lower someone's racial resentment score, the better for us. in this example, where we're using the ideology enhanced score, we want our scores to be higher. So the higher the score on this model, the more likely somebody is to support progressive policies. The lower the score, the more conservative they're likely to be. So that's just kind of explaining like what do the different scores mean? Now, what actually is this data telling us? So the data is showing that there is a pretty wide distribution of scores assigned to people. We've got a lot of folks who've got really low scores between sort of 19 and 35. We've got a pretty big bucket of people with higher scores above about 71. Um, so we can look at those trends and start to identify, okay, who is our base? Who are the people who are most supportive? Who is our opposition? The people who are least supportive. On the left side of the graph, at about 35 and below, we see our opposition. So remember, I was saying that it's kind of here and below. That bucket of people is our opposition. On the right side of the graph, at about 71 and above, that's our base. Everyone else, so people with scores between 35 and 71, as well as voters we have less data about, who don't have a score in this model, will be our persuadable group. So there are 29,444 base voters, 32,403 opposition voters, and 47,533 persuasion voters. And you can just see on this graph, I've added kind of red lines showing the demarcation between our base, which is on the right side here, our opposition, which is on the left side here, and then this big group in the middle are our persuadables. And we're also going to include anybody who doesn't have the data required to have an ideology enhanced score in our persuadables bucket. Meanwhile, we also want to look at this child presence score that is identifying how likely it is that somebody has a child in the home. The trend line in this graph looks different. There's a lot of clustering of people with very low scores. That's likely to be very young and significantly older voters who aren't going to have children at home. And then we have this long tail of pretty even distribution going along. That makes this graph a little bit more difficult to interpret. From past modeling that we have done, and from interpreting this graph, I drew the cutoff here at scores of 60 and above for our estimate of voters with children present at home. So that's the red line on the graph. And there are about 28,000 people in that cohort. Okay, now what? Now that we've looked at how many people fall into these different groups, we also need to consider how many of these people are regular voters. Just being registered to vote does not guarantee that these people are actually registered voters and are going to go cast a ballot in this hypothetical ballot referendum situation this year. After we get a sense of that, we can start considering how we're going to build out our political plan. To identify who these voters are, we're going to look at their previous voting history. This is another area where we differ from some political parties and campaigns who will use a model to identify the likelihood that someone votes. These scores can be problematic because they don't only rely on previous vote history. That's one element of the model, but it's not the only thing that's in the model. And they also utilize additional factors like age, race, and class. To try and get away from some of those problematic elements, we just look at past vote history and consider the context of the upcoming election as well as the context of elections in the past. So in this hypothetical scenario, the ballot measure we are looking to pass is on the ballot this year, 2022, a midterm election where voter enthusiasm and turnout tends to be lower than in presidential elections. And we know from a lot of the polling that's been done lately, voter enthusiasm is significantly down on 2022 as it was compared to 2020 and 2018. So how do we break these voters out by vote propensity? We start with the people likeliest to vote, those that have voted in 4 of the last 5 general elections. That's 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018, and 2020. This likely voters cohort may look different depending on the election in question. We know that voter turnout is highest for presidential elections, then drops off for midterm elections and drops off further for off-year, special, and primary elections. So if, for example, we were trying to identify the likely voters in a partisan primary election in August, we might look at past vote history for specific partisan primary elections. It wouldn't just be looking at the past number of general elections. Our next tier of voter are those I call retention voters. These are people that voted in 2018 or 2020 who did not vote in 2016 or 2014. We know that the 2018 and 2020 elections saw increased turnout among progressive voters who often sit out midterm elections. And as we work to pass this levy, we're going to need these people to turn out. The following tier of voters are those I'm calling lower tier likely voters. This group of voters voted in at least 2 of the 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections. So they have a significant recent voting history, but have not necessarily voted as regularly as those that vote in almost every election. After that, our fourth tier are potential surge voters. I say surge because this cohort voted in 2020 and did not vote in 2014, 2016, or 2018. They do not have a history of being regular voters. However, they did just vote in the last statewide election. It'll be important to learn who they are because if they come and vote in this election, they could have a significant impact. Finally, the last tier of voters to look at are those who are called electorate expansion voters, or people who didn't vote in 2018 or 2020. They're likely to be lower data voters and will be farther down the priority list of voters that we call and door knock this fall. However, we will still hope to reach them through relational organizing and through building out a base large enough to expand our universe of door and phone targets. And that piece is really important because one way that people get cut out of the universe of voters that campaigns will reach out to is because they have lower vote propensity scores. We don't want to be writing anybody off. And at the same time, there's this awkward tension between we don't want to write anybody off, we don't want to cut anybody out of our universe, and we also only have so much capacity to make phone calls and to door knock, which is part of why it is so important that you're utilizing tools like relational organizing to expand the universe of people that you can reach out to through as many different means as you have at your disposal. How many people actually fit into these categories? So remember, we have 109,000 registered voters in VAN. The majority of them are in the likely voter cohort, where there are over 65,000 voters, and there are significantly more opposition than base voters, which you can see on your screen there. As we move down the tiers of vote propensity, base begins to outnumber opposition, which again is there on the screen. However, the cohorts of voters moving down in vote propensity are getting a lot smaller. And one thing that is pretty clear to me is that if we're going to win, we need to both turn out as many base voters as we can, and we need to persuade voters to support our side of this argument. There's often a false choice presented when we're talking about progressive campaigns about, what is the thing that we need to do to win? Do we need to raise turnout among base voters, or do we need to persuade people who are in the middle who are always going to vote? And that's a false choice because, as is the case in this hypothetical scenario, and is the case in most elections, if you're going to win, you need to do both of those things. You need to turn out as many people as you can who do agree with you, who do share your values, and you also need to make strong, compelling arguments that persuade people who are persuadable, who are always going to vote, that they should vote with you in this election. That is going to be our path to victory here. Okay, so now what? Now it's time to start building out a political plan. We're going to do that by estimating the voter turnout in this election, finding our win number, and thinking about the interventions we need to make in the field to win this election. Then we'll consider what kind of field plan we need to build to make those interventions possible. All of that will come in part 2 of this training. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again shortly.